In this lesson, we'll learn about the .NET Framework, about namespaces, and about importing, or rather using a namespace in your project. Additionally, I'll show you how to create your own namespaces and how to change the default namespace for the project that you're working with. To illustrate some of the concepts, I'm going to create a new project. As you see, I've created Lesson 14. And to begin with, I'm just going to put a button on here and double-click the button to get into the code view. And what I'm going to do is just illustrate how I might go about creating a connection to a database. So I might go system, make sure your capitalization is correct, system.data.SQL client.SQL connection con. Now you won't learn about SQL connections in any depth in this beginner series of lessons, although I talk about it extensively on the rest of LearnVisualStudio.net. What I want to impress on you right now is how I went about using one of the classes in the .NET Framework, the SQL Connection class. This class was developed to manage the interaction between an application and a computer that contains a program called Microsoft SQL Server, which is a high-end database server used by many corporations. In fact, the SQL Connection class belongs to the namespace system.data.SQL client. And there's actually quite a few classes in this namespace that I use on practically a daily basis, like the SQL command object, the data adapter, the data reader, and I use the SQL exception, and so on. Instead of having to type system.data.SQL client.whatever the class I need is, each and every time that I go to use one of these classes, what I can do instead is just kind of highlight all of this, everything before the actual class that I want to use, my SQL Connection class. I'm just going to highlight all of that and hit Control X on my keyboard. Then I'm going to go to the very top of my file where all the rest of the using statements are, and I'm going to type in using. I'm going to replace that period with a end of line semicolon. The using keyword is a convenient way to avoid using the fully qualified name of types in other namespaces. It basically allows me to not have to type out each and every time the fully qualified name of the class each and every time I want to use one of the classes, in this case the SQL client namespace. So now, instead of that big long string to create a connection object, all I need to do is SQL connection con. And my application knows exactly the class that I'm referring to because it's the only class called SQL connection in the list of using statements. If I wanted to use an additional namespace, I could type, for example, using system.security. And now I'd have access to all the classes in the system.security namespace. It's kind of a shortcut. By default, there are a number of namespaces that are imported into your project when you create a new project in VisualStudio.net. Here are the two that I just added, but notice for a Windows Forms application, all of the namespaces that were added by default whenever I created a Windows Form app. In the lesson text, I talked about creating your own namespaces, and by default, your projects do have namespaces. They have namespaces for the same reasons that every class within the .NET Framework has a namespace, and that is to resolve any potential conflicts between names that are given by one or more projects, or rather, names of classes with assemblies on your computer or within your computing environment if you work for a large company. If I right-click the project icon in the Solution Explorer and select Property, I can see the property pages for my current project. And notice that not only does it have the name of the assembly that will be created once my project becomes compiled, but other information like the output type, whether it's going to be a Windows application, a class library, a console application, and so on. And when the application starts up, what it should show. In this case, it's not set here, but rather in the code. Now, for the purpose of this video, however, we're interested in this default namespace property. which by default is set to the same name as the project and the assembly name. Now we can change this namespace to anything that we want to. So if we work for a company, let's say it's the Acme Corporation, we could enter Acme here as the default namespace. And no matter how many projects that the programmers within our company created, we would all use the same default namespace of Acme. In fact, we might even break it down by department. So I might be in the accounting department and have a root namespace or a default namespace of acme.accounting. So all the assemblies from all the projects that we create for that department would have the same default namespace, acme.accounting. This would prevent any naming conflicts between classes, say between the Acme Accounting Department and the Acme Information Technology Department, which might have a different default namespace. The key concept is just this, that you can modify the namespace, and the namespaces are only there to protect the classes that you write from having a name conflict with other classes that you or other developers within your company create for the applications that they're working on. Let me clarify this just a little bit. It's not a problem to create two projects on your local hard drive or within your company's computing environment that have the exact same class name. It's not even a problem if they have the same default namespace and class name as well. The only problem this would create is if you were to try to use both of those classes within the same project. It's at that point in time that there would be a conflict. So I hope that clarification helps you understand why namespaces are used. It's kind of like surnames. I think that's the example that we drew from in the lesson text, so that you can make sure that you're dealing with just one individual instead of potentially multiple individuals that just happen to share the same name. Because invariably when you're trying to create applications, names will begin to pose a problem if you have a very large application to work on. So I hope that clarification helps you understand why namespaces are used and even how to use namespaces in an effective way for projects that you create and projects that you might potentially create for a company. So let's get back on track. This is one place where you can set the default namespace, but it's not the only way to set the namespace for classes that you're working on. I'm going to click the cancel button here. The other way is to use the namespace syntax as you see here. In C#, the class and form templates include the namespace by default. So all we need to do is change the namespace at the top of this file. So let's do that. Acme will be the new namespace for our form. So now our public class form1 is actually in the Acme namespace. Now we could create another class right here and it too would be in the Acme namespace as long as I kept it within the brackets. So let's go public class customer and so now I have a customer class within the Acme namespace. And let's have a little bit of fun and let's add a new class that we're going to call customer. And just to test your comprehension, would there be a problem with this class customer and this class customer that we created? And the answer is no, and that's because the fully qualified name for this customer is acme.customer, and the fully qualified name for this customer is lesson 14 customer. Let's continue to toy around with this a little bit just to prove the point. What if I were to change this from lesson 14 to Acme? Well, at first nothing would really happen, but let's try to run the application. And we would get an error, an exception, that says the namespace Acme already contains a definition for customer. And now you can see there's a little blue squiggly line under this customer. So this is the exact thing that the namespace is trying to help us to avoid, naming conflicts. Now as a side note, that kind of illustrates another way that namespaces are neat. Even though you have separate files, the customer file and the form file, you can group together classes and forms and other resources for your project using namespaces, even if they're in different physical files on your hard drive. And in closing, my admonition to you would be to not worry so much about namespaces. You're going to encounter them, but from my experience, a lot of people get overly concerned about namespaces at first. It's actually a rather simple idea, and you shouldn't try to make it harder than it really is. When developing smaller projects, they really don't affect you very much. However, namespaces are all over the place when dealing with .NET, and so from that perspective, it's important to understand why namespaces are used. And as always, I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to read the lesson text for Lesson 14, especially the extended readings, which are basically the C# specification, and also take the time to fill out the definitions and the lesson questions. These will help you absorb more of the information that's been presented. Thank you.